The afternoon of October 5th, 1944. 12,000 feet above the Netherlands, 5 Spitfires slice through scattered clouds. Squadron leader Rod Smith scans the sky below, his Merlin engine purring steady. Nijmegen sprawls beneath them, the bridges over the Vaal River still scarred from Operation Market Garden 3 weeks prior. His wingmen fly a tight formation, their elliptical wings catching the autumn sun. Then Smith sees it.
A shape that doesn't belong.
Twin-engine nacelles slung beneath swept wings, a silhouette he's only seen in intelligence briefings. The German jet. The Messerschmitt 262. It's diving toward Nijmegen, low and fast, closing on the bridge. Smith's heart hammers. This is the aircraft that's been terrorizing bomber formations, slashing through escorts like they're standing still. 540 miles per hour. 120 miles per hour faster than his Spitfire. Armed with 4 30mm cannons that can shred a flying fortress in seconds. But something's wrong with this one. It's not running. It's maneuvering, turning back toward them. The jet pilot has made a choice, and it's the wrong one. Smith keys his radio. Tally-ho. That's a 262. All aircraft, attack. The 5 Spitfires roll into their dives. Flight Lieutenant Davenport on his left, Flight Lieutenant Everard on his right, Flying Officers McKay and Sinclair completing the formation. 5 propeller-driven fighters against the world's first operational jet. The textbooks say it's impossible. The speed advantage alone should let the German escape at will. But the textbooks don't account for everything. The Messerschmitt turns to meet them, and for a moment its pilot opens fire. 30mm shells arc past Smith's canopy, but the deflection is wrong. The jet flashes by and Smith yanks his Spitfire around, the 9Gs pressing him into his seat as the aircraft groans in protest. But he holds the turn. The Merlin screams, the elliptical wings bite the air, and he's coming around onto the jet's tail. The German pilot pushes his throttles forward, but the response is sluggish. 5 minutes. That's how long the Junkers Jumo 004 engines need to spool from idle to full power. 5 minutes the Allies discovered through captured documents and bitter experience. And in a dogfight, 5 minutes might as well be forever. Smith lines up his gun sight. The jet grows larger in his windscreen, and he squeezes the trigger. His 8 Browning machine guns roar to life, tracers reaching out across the sky. Hits. Pieces fly from the jet's fuselage. But it's not enough. The Messerschmitt pulls away, still accelerating, still dangerous. Then Davenport is there, his guns chattering. More hits. The jet staggers. Everard follows, his burst walking across the twin tail booms. Now McKay, his shells finding the starboard engine. And finally Sinclair, his fire raking the length of the fuselage. 5 Spitfires, 5 separate attacks, each one adding to the cumulative damage that no single fighter could inflict alone. Smoke begins to pour from the jet. Black, thick smoke that trails behind like a banner. The Messerschmitt's nose drops. The pilot is fighting it now, fighting the controls, but the aircraft is dying. It rolls inverted and begins its final dive. Smith watches it fall, watches it accelerate toward the Dutch countryside below, trailing fire and smoke. The impact is visible even from 12,000 feet. A flash, then a column of smoke rising from farmland 5 miles northeast of Nijmegen. The first jet fighter ever shot down by gunfire in history has just crashed into occupied Holland. Did anyone see us shoot? Smith's voice is calm on the radio, but his hands are shaking on the stick. Silence. Then Davenport's reply. Negative, leader. No shoot. In the wreckage below, Hauptmann Hans Christoph Buttmann of the 3rd Staffel, Camp Jeschwader 51 will be found still strapped in his seat. 24 years old. A bomber pilot transitioning to the most advanced fighter in the world. He'd chosen to fight when he should have run, and that choice killed him. But Smith doesn't know this yet. All he knows is that they've just done something everyone said was impossible. They've killed a jet. The future has just collided with the present, and the present has won. For now. Because 200 miles to the east, at airfields scattered across Germany, more Messerschmitt 262s are being prepared for flight. More pilots are climbing into cockpits of aircraft that can outrun, outclimb, and outgun anything the Allies can put in the sky. The jet age has arrived, and what happened over Nijmegen today will be studied, analyzed, and refined by both sides in the desperate months ahead. This is not the end of the jet threat. It's barely the beginning. But it proves something critical. The wonder weapon can bleed. To understand how 5 propeller-driven Spitfires could defeat the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, we must first understand the revolution that the Messerschmitt 262 represented. In the autumn of 1944, when most fighters still relied on piston engines and propellers, technology unchanged in its fundamentals since the Wright brothers, the 262 was something else entirely. It was a glimpse of the future, dropped into a war that wasn't ready for it. The design began in 1939 before the war even started. German engineers at Messerschmitt, led by Dr. Waldemar Voigt, were working on a radical concept, a fighter powered not by a propeller, but by jet turbines. The advantages were obvious on paper. No propeller meant no limitations on speed from compressibility effects. No reciprocating engine meant fewer moving parts, less vibration, less weight. And most importantly, jets could operate at altitudes where piston engines gasped for oxygen. But the reality was far more complicated than the theory. The first prototype flew on April 18, 1941, but only with a conventional Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine in its nose driving a propeller because the jet engines weren't ready. When the BMW 003 turbojets were finally installed, both failed during the first jet-powered flight attempt. The test pilot had to land using only the nose-mounted piston engine. It would take another year before the aircraft flew successfully on jet power alone. July 18, 1942. The test pilot was Fritz Wendel, and he reported that the aircraft was astonishingly fast, but also temperamental, dangerous, and prone to catastrophic engine failures. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines that powered the production aircraft had a service life of just 10 to 25 flight hours. After that, they had to be completely replaced. The turbine blades were made from inferior alloys because Germany lacked access to the rare metals needed for proper high-temperature materials. They would crack, warp, and sometimes disintegrate at full power. But despite these problems, the performance was undeniable. Top speed, 540 miles per hour. Nearly 100 miles per hour faster than a P-51 Mustang. Service ceiling, 37,500 feet. Rate of climb, 3,900 feet per minute. And the armament, 4 Mk108 30mm cannons. Each shell weighed 730 grams. A single hit from one of these weapons could blow the wing off a 4-engine bomber. The aircraft entered service in July of 1944, initially with Commando Nowotny, a test unit led by Major Walter Nowotny, an ace with 258 victories. On July 25, 1944, Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber flying a 262 encountered a British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft over Munich. Schreiber attacked 3 times, but the Mosquito pilot evaded each run and escaped to Italy. The jet age had begun, but nobody died. Not yet. The first confirmed kill came on August 8, when a 262 shot down a Mosquito. More followed. By September, American bomber crews were reporting encounters with aircraft that could pass them like they were standing still. The escorts, even the vaunted Mustangs, were helpless. The jets would approach from behind and above, accelerate to over 600 miles per hour in their dive, fire their cannons or newly developed R-4M rockets, then use their momentum to climb back to altitude before the escorts could react. It was a new form of warfare, and the Allies were losing it. General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Army Air Forces in Europe, expressed fear in September 1944 that if the Germans could field the jets in greater numbers, they could inflict losses heavy enough to force the cancellation of the daylight bombing offensive. The strategic air war that had cost tens of thousands of American and British lives, that had reduced German cities to rubble and crippled their war industry, could be undone by this single technological leap. But the 262 had vulnerabilities, critical ones. And by October of 1944, Allied intelligence was beginning to understand them. The first vulnerability was the engines themselves. The Jumo 004s required careful handling. If the throttle was advanced too quickly, the fuel flow would surge, causing the jet pipe temperature to spike dangerously. The compressor would stall. The engine would flame out. In combat, where pilots needed instant power response to evade or pursue, this was potentially fatal. Tu-62 pilots were instructed to make all throttle movements slowly and smoothly. But in the chaos of a dogfight, with Spitfires or Mustangs on your tail, slowly and smoothly could get you killed. The second vulnerability was speed itself. At 540 miles per hour, the Tu-62 approached Allied bomber formations so quickly that pilots had mere seconds to aim and fire. The high-speed convergence made deflection shooting almost impossible. German pilots found themselves overshooting their targets, then having to use precious fuel and time to come around for another pass while Allied escorts climbed to meet them. The third vulnerability was maneuverability at low speed. The Tu-62 had a high wing loading of 60.2 pounds per square foot. This meant it needed high speeds to generate lift. At low speeds, particularly during takeoff and landing, it wallowed. The automatic leading edge slats helped, deploying below 300 kilometers per hour to increase lift by 35%, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. At slow speeds, the jet was a pig, and any propeller-driven fighter could outturn it. The fourth vulnerability was fuel consumption. The Jumo 004 engines were thirsty. A combat sortie might last only 60 minutes before the aircraft had to return to base or risk flaming out over enemy territory. And by the autumn of 1944, Allied bombing had devastated German fuel production. Tu-62s were sometimes towed to the end of runways by horses to conserve fuel for actual flight. And the fifth vulnerability, the most critical one, was the approach pattern itself. Every aircraft, no matter how advanced, must eventually land. Must slow down, drop flaps, lower landing gear, and make a long, straight final approach to the runway. For a Tu-62, with its engines already at low power and unable to spool up quickly, with its speed below 300 kilometers per hour and its maneuverability compromised, those final minutes before touchdown were a death trap. Allied pilots discovered this quickly. By August of 1944, they'd stopped trying to chase the jets at altitude. Instead, they began loitering near known jet bases, waiting, watching. And when a Tu-62 appeared in the landing pattern, slow and vulnerable, they pounced. On August 28, 1944, Major Joseph Myers and Second Lieutenant Manfred Crory of the 78th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, spotted a Tu-62 trying to land. They didn't shoot. They simply maneuvered aggressively around the jet, forcing the pilot to take evasive action at low altitude and low speed. The jet ran out of airspeed and altitude simultaneously and crashed into the ground. The pilot, Oberfeldwebel Aeronymous Lauer, survived. No shots had been fired by either side. It happened again on October 2nd. Lieutenant Volmor Bodralt, also flying a P-47, caught another Tu-62 low on fuel trying to land. He pursued it relentlessly at low level until it ran completely out of fuel and had to crash land. The pilot was, astonishingly, the same man, Oberfeldwebel Lauer. He survived again. 2 encounters with Allied fighters, 2 crashes, 0 shots fired, and 1 incredibly unlucky pilot who would have quite a story to tell after the war. But these weren't true victories. They were aggressive maneuvering that caused crashes. What no one had yet done, what seemed almost impossible given the speed differential, was to actually shoot down a Tu-62 in air-to-air combat. To engage it, damage it, and destroy it with gunfire. That barrier would be broken on October 5, 1944, over the Netherlands. And it would be broken not by Americans, but by Canadians. Before we continue, I want to remind you that understanding these incredible stories requires careful research and historical accuracy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation history, consider subscribing to see more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Squadron leader Roderick Illingworth Alpine Smith, known as Rod to his friends, was 31 years old in October of 1944. He was a veteran of Malta, where he'd flown combat missions during some of the most intense air battles of the Mediterranean campaign. Malta, that tiny island between Sicily and North Africa, had been under siege for years. The Italians and Germans had tried to bomb it into submission, and the RAF pilots defending it, outnumbered and outgunned, had fought them to a standstill. Smith had survived Malta, which meant he knew how to fight when the odds were bad. And he knew how to lead. He'd taken command of 401 Squadron in September of 1944, just weeks before the encounter over Nijmegen. The squadron had a distinguished history. Originally formed as No. 1 Squadron RCAF, it had fought in the Battle of Britain, been renumbered 401 Squadron in March 1941 to avoid confusion with No. 1 Squadron RAF, and had been in continuous combat ever since. By October 1944, they were flying Spitfire Mark 9s, operating from B-84 airfield at Rips in the Netherlands, supporting the Allied advance into Germany. The Spitfire Mark 9 was itself a response to technological threat. When the Focke-Wulf 190A appeared over France in 1941, it outperformed the Spitfire Mark 5 in nearly every category. The RAF needed an answer quickly. They took the Spitfire 5 airframe and installed the more powerful Merlin 61 engine, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger that gave it excellent performance at high altitude. The result was the Mark 9, rushed into service in June 1942. It could fight the Focke-Wulf 190 on equal terms, and it remained competitive even as the war entered its final year. But against a 262, the Mark 9 was hopelessly outclassed in straight-line performance. Its top speed was around 408 miles per hour. Fast, but not fast enough. Its service ceiling was 43,000 feet, higher than the jet's, but irrelevant since the jet could climb there faster. And its rate of climb, 3,950 feet per minute, was marginally better than the jet's, but again, the jet's acceleration advantage made this academic. What the Spitfire had was maneuverability. Those famous elliptical wings, designed by Reginald Mitchell in the 1930s, gave it an exceptionally low wing loading and excellent turning performance. A Spitfire could outturn almost anything in the sky, including the 262. But turning fights only happened at low to medium speeds. And in October of 1944, conventional wisdom said you'd never get a 262 to slow down enough to engage in a turning fight. The jet would simply run away, unless the pilot made a mistake. On the afternoon of October 5th, Smith led 12 Spitfires of 401 Squadron on a high patrol mission over the Arnhem-Nijmegen area. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied airborne operation to seize bridges across the Netherlands and open a route into Germany, had failed spectacularly in September. The British 1st Airborne Division had been destroyed at Arnhem, but Nijmegen's bridges had been captured, and Allied forces were still pushing forward, still trying to turn the tactical success at Nijmegen into something larger. The squadron took off at 13:53 hours. The weather was mixed, scattered clouds with good visibility between them. They climbed to 12,000 feet and began their patrol pattern. Below them, the Dutch countryside was a patchwork of fields and canals, still showing scars from weeks of fighting. The front lines were fluid here, with German forces still holding strong positions to the north and east. At 14:45 hours, Smith spotted movement below and to the south. An aircraft. Single-engine profile, but wrong. Too sleek. Twin-engine nacelles mounted underneath the wings instead of on the nose. The characteristic swept wings and twin-tail booms of the Messerschmitt 262. It was diving toward Nijmegen, probably on a ground attack mission against the bridges. Smith called it out immediately. Tally-ho. Messerschmitt 262. All aircraft. But only 5 Spitfires were in position to attack. Smith himself, Flight Lieutenant Davenport, Flight Lieutenant Everard, Flying Officer McKay, and Flying Officer Sinclair. The other 7 Spitfires were too far away to join the initial engagement. The 5 Spitfires rolled into their attack dives. This was it. The moment intelligence briefings had prepared them for. The jet they'd been warned about, told was almost invincible. And here it was below them, within range. They dove. The 262 pilot, Hauptmann Hans Christoph Buttmann, saw them coming. He had choices. He could firewall his throttles, wait for the engines to spool up and run. At full power, the jet could accelerate away from the Spitfires in seconds. They couldn't catch him in level flight. They couldn't catch him in a dive. He could escape with near certainty. But man didn't run. Maybe he thought he could scatter them with a quick burst. Maybe he thought a jet was invincible in any circumstance. Maybe he was still thinking like a bomber pilot, accustomed to relying on defensive guns rather than evasion. Or maybe he was just confident, perhaps too confident, in his aircraft's capabilities. He turned to engage them, and he opened fire. The Mk-108 cannons barked, and 30mm shells arced through the sky towards Smith's Spitfire. But deflection shooting is difficult, and Buttman's rounds passed wide. Then the jet flashed past the Spitfires at high speed, its momentum carrying it through their formation. Smith pulled his Spitfire into a maximum G turn, the wings groaning under the load, the Merlin screaming at full power. The aircraft shuddered on the edge of a high-speed stall. But he held the turn. And when he came around, the jet was there, ahead of him, still relatively close. But man had made his fatal mistake. He'd slowed down to maneuver. He'd extended his engagement instead of running. And now his throttles were forward, his engines were trying to spool up, but the response was slow. So terribly slow. Smith lined up his gun sight. The jet was growing in his windscreen but still moving away, still accelerating. He squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning .303 caliber machine guns roared to life, 4 in each wing. Armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, mixed together, reaching out at 2,800 feet per second. The muzzle velocity was high, but the bullets were light. And the range was long, maybe 400 yards. Some rounds hit. He saw impacts on the jet's fuselage, saw pieces flying off. But it wasn't enough. The structural damage wasn't critical. And the jet was pulling away now, accelerating faster. In seconds it would be gone. Then Davenport was there. His Spitfire had completed its turn slightly inside Smith's. He opened fire, a long burst, and more rounds hammered into the jet. More hits. More damage. Then Everard. His burst was shorter, more controlled, but better aimed. Rounds walked across the jet's twin tail booms. Then McKay. His shells found the starboard engine nacelle. And something inside, either the turbine itself or the fuel lines feeding it, was damaged. And finally Sinclair. His fire raked the length of the fuselage, and suddenly smoke poured from the jet. Black smoke, thick and oily. The cumulative damage from 5 separate attacks had overwhelmed the aircraft. No single Spitfire could have inflicted enough damage in one pass. But 5 attacks, one after another, each one adding to what came before, created a cascade of failures that the jet couldn't survive. But man fought the controls. The aircraft was responding sluggishly now, the damaged engine producing thrust irregularly, the control surfaces partially jammed from battle damage. He tried to level out, tried to make it back to friendly territory. But the smoke was getting worse. Then fire. Bright orange flames licking back from the starboard engine. The nose dropped. The jet began to roll inverted. But man may have tried to bail out at this point, but at low altitude with an aircraft in an inverted dive, the time available is measured in single seconds. The jet accelerated toward the ground, trailing fire. It impacted 5 miles northeast of Nijmegen at grid reference E655588. The high-speed crash scattered wreckage across Dutch farmland. The explosion was visible to Allied troops on the ground. The smoke column rose high enough to be seen from Nijmegen itself. When Allied personnel reached the crash site later that day, they found devastation. The aircraft had hit at high speed, perhaps 400 miles per hour or more. It had disintegrated. The engines were buried deep in the earth. The wings were shredded. The fuselage was in pieces. And Hauptmann Hans Christoph Buttmann, 24 years old, was found still strapped in his cockpit seat. He'd never had time to bail out. The 5 Spitfires circled overhead for a moment, confirming the crash, then turned back toward their base at Rips. The engagement had lasted perhaps 3 minutes from first sighting to impact. 3 minutes that changed the perception of the jet threat. The squadron landed at 15:08 hours. Squadron leader Smith filed his combat report. The language was matter-of-fact, almost understated, as combat reports always were. But the significance was clear. The squadron had engaged a Messerschmitt 262 in air-to-air combat. The enemy aircraft had returned fire on several occasions, but hit nothing. 5 pilots had fired. The jet had burned in the air and crashed in friendly territory. And then, the final line. It is believed that this is the first jet-propelled aircraft to be destroyed by the RAF or RCF fighters.
Believed.
Because in the chaos of war, records are incomplete and claims conflict. But this one was true. 401 Squadron had scored the first confirmed victory by gunfire over a jet fighter in history. The aircraft that everyone said couldn't be caught, couldn't be fought, couldn't be defeated by conventional fighters had been caught, fought, and defeated. The myth of invincibility was broken. The question was, what would the Germans learn from this? And what would the Allies learn? Because the war was far from over, and hundreds more 262s were being produced in underground factories across Germany. October 5, 1944, was not the end of the jet age. It was the beginning of a new phase of the air war, one that would last until Germany's final collapse 7 months later. The news of 401 Squadron's victory traveled quickly through Allied intelligence channels. Within days, every fighter squadron in the European theater of operations received updated briefings on jet tactics. The message was clear. The Messerschmitt 262 was not invincible. It could be engaged. It could be damaged. It could be destroyed. But the briefings also emphasized caution. The October 5th engagement had succeeded because of specific circumstances, multiple attackers, the jet pilot's decision to engage rather than run, and the cumulative effect of 5 separate attacks. Squadron leader Smith himself noted in subsequent debriefings that if man had simply applied full throttle and climbed away immediately, the Spitfires would have had no chance. The victory was real, but it was also fragile, dependent on the enemy making mistakes. The Germans, meanwhile, were conducting their own analysis. The loss of Butman's aircraft was troubling, but not catastrophic. More concerning was the pattern emerging from multiple incidents. 262s were being caught at low altitude, during takeoff and landing, in situations where their speed advantage couldn't be brought to bear. The jets were vulnerable on the ground and in the traffic pattern, and Allied pilots were learning to exploit this. Major Walter Nowotny, commander of Commando Nowotny, the test unit evaluating jet tactics, was acutely aware of these problems. By late October 1944, he'd lost multiple aircraft and pilots, not to enemy fighters in high-altitude combat where the jets should dominate, but to ambushes during landing approaches. Nowotny himself would die on November 8, 1944, when his 262 was caught by American P-51 Mustangs while trying to land at Akmer Airfield. He crashed attempting to reach the runway with one engine already on fire. Whether he was shot down or suffered mechanical failure remains disputed, but the result was the same. One of Germany's greatest aces, killed not in glorious aerial combat, but in the vulnerable seconds before landing. The Luftwaffe's response was to establish heavy anti-aircraft protection around jet bases. By November of 1944, airfields like Akmer, Rain, and Hezeby bristled with 20mm and 37mm flak guns. The approach paths were covered by interlocking fields of fire. Standing patrols of Focke-Wulf 190DS were maintained to intercept Allied fighters attempting to loiter near the bases. It became incredibly dangerous for Allied pilots to hunt jets at their home fields. But the Allies adapted again. If they couldn't ambush jets at their bases, they'd intercept them en route to targets. And they developed a new tactic: ignore the jets at high altitude, where they're fast and deadly. Instead, engage them when they slow down to attack bombers. Force them to maneuver. Make them burn fuel. And when they have to break off and return to base, follow them. Not close enough to be engaged, but close enough to track them back to their airfields. Then report those locations to intelligence so that bombers could strike the bases themselves. This cat-and-mouse game defined jet operations for the remainder of 1944. The Germans tried to mass their jets for maximum impact. On November 2, 1944, 3262s from Jägerschwader 7 attacked American bomber formations near Merseburg. They claimed 14 bombers destroyed. American records confirmed 7 B-17 losses to jet attack. It was the most successful single jet operation of the war. But even this success had costs. 5 Tu-62s were lost. 3 to mechanical failure, 1 to anti-aircraft fire, and 1 to a P-51 Mustang that caught it during the climb out from the attack. The kill ratio was favorable to the Germans, but not overwhelmingly so. And with chronic fuel shortages limiting sortie rates, even favorable exchanges were unsustainable. Understanding the technological race between jets and propeller fighters reveals just how close Germany came to changing the air war's outcome. If you're finding these details as fascinating as I do, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future episodes exploring the weapons and tactics that shaped World War II. By December of 1944, Allied fighter pilots had developed a rough understanding of how to fight Tu-62s. Major Charles Yeager, who would later become the first person to break the sound barrier, encountered a Tu-62 on November 6, 1944, while flying a P-51 Mustang. His approach was instructive.
He didn't try to dogfight it.
He didn't try to chase it in level flight. Instead, he positioned himself above and behind the jet, waited for it to commit to an attack on bombers, then dove on it while it was focused on its targets and flying in a predictable straight line. Yeager opened fire from close range, perhaps 200 yards, and walked his rounds into the jet's fuselage. The Tu-62 caught fire immediately and crashed. Yeager's combat report was clinical. He'd used altitude advantage and surprise to negate the jet's speed advantage. He'd engaged only when the enemy was distracted and predictable. And he'd fired from close range to ensure hits. These became the standard tactics taught to all fighter pilots facing jets. But implementing these tactics required discipline, patience, and often a willingness to let jets escape if the conditions weren't right. Many pilots, seeing a jet for the first time, would give chase instinctively, wasting fuel and ammunition on an aircraft they couldn't catch. The successful pilots were those who could suppress that instinct, who could wait for the right moment, who understood that fighting a Tu-62 required thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess player. The British developed their own approach, codenamed Operation Rat Catching. It was exactly what the name implied: find a rat's nest and wait for them to come out. Intelligence had identified the primary jet bases. Reconnaissance flights had mapped the approach patterns. Now, flights of Spitfires and Tempests would loiter at medium altitude, just out of range of the heavy flak, watching for jets taking off or landing. The tactic was dangerous. German flak gunners were skilled and motivated, and the British lost aircraft to ground fire regularly. But the tactic worked. On December 17, 1944, Flight Lieutenant Tony Gaze of 609 Squadron, flying a Hawker Tempest, shot down a Tu-62 on approach to Rain Airfield. The jet was at low altitude, gear and flaps down, speed below 200 miles per hour. Gaze dove from above, fired a 3-second burst, and the jet exploded. The pilot, Feldwebel Erich Buttner, was killed instantly. 5 days later, on December 22nd, Squadron Leader Don Lobman of 412 Squadron, also flying a Tempest, caught 2 more Tu-62s in the landing pattern at Rain. He shot down the first one, then immediately engaged the second as it tried to abort its landing and go around. Both jets crashed. Both pilots died. Lobman had scored 2 jet victories in less than 2 minutes, exploiting the precise moment of maximum vulnerability when aircraft are slow, heavy, and committed to landing. The psychological impact of these losses on German jet pilots was significant. Every takeoff and landing became an ordeal. The security of the home airfield, traditionally a sanctuary where pilots could relax, was gone. Allied fighters prowled constantly. Even with heavy flak protection, even with standing patrols of conventional fighters, the risk remained. And the risk was highest for inexperienced pilots who needed more time in the landing pattern to get configured and stabilized. By January of 1945, the training pipeline for Tu-62 pilots was breaking down. Fuel shortages meant reduced training hours. New pilots were arriving at operational units with minimal jet experience, sometimes as few as 10 hours. These pilots, already struggling with the peculiarities of jet engines and high-speed flight, were being sent into combat against Allied pilots who had years of experience and who had developed specific tactics for killing jets. The results were predictable. Loss rates among novice Tu-62 pilots were catastrophic. Some never survived their first week of operations. Others were killed on their first combat sortie. The jets themselves were often undamaged in these crashes. The pilots simply lacked the skill to handle them under combat stress. But even experienced pilots were vulnerable. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive low-level strike against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The goal was to destroy Allied air power on the ground in a single devastating blow. Over 900 German aircraft participated, including conventional fighters and fighter bombers. But no Tu-62s. The jet units were specifically excluded from the operation.
Why?
Because flying jets at low altitude, at high speed, over unfamiliar terrain, with Allied anti-aircraft guns active everywhere, was considered too risky even by German standards. The jets were too valuable, too scarce, and too difficult to replace. They would be conserved for high-altitude interception missions where their advantages could be fully exploited. Operation Bodenplatte achieved tactical surprise and destroyed approximately 465 Allied aircraft on the ground. But it cost the Luftwaffe approximately 300 aircraft and, more critically, over 230 experienced pilots killed or captured. These were pilots the Germans could not replace. The operation was a strategic disaster disguised as a tactical success, and it gutted the conventional fighter force that had been protecting the jet bases. With fewer conventional fighters available for airfield defense, Allied rat-catching operations became even more effective. In January of 1945 alone, Allied fighters claimed 27 Tu-62s destroyed. German records confirm 21 jet losses that month, with at least 15 occurring during takeoff or landing phases. The Tu-62 units tried to adapt. They began using multiple decoy flights, with conventional fighters simulating jet approach patterns to draw off Allied ambushers. They varied their approach routes randomly. They established alternate landing fields so that damaged jets could divert if their primary field was under attack. Some pilots began making high-speed, overhead approaches, diving directly from altitude to the runway threshold to minimize time at low speed. It was dangerous, it required exceptional skill, and it resulted in landing accidents, but it reduced exposure to Allied fighters. None of these measures solved the fundamental problem. The Tu-62 had to land eventually, and landing required slowing down. Physics couldn't be negotiated with. Meanwhile, production of Tu-62s was accelerating despite Allied bombing. In January of 1945, 164 jets were delivered to operational units. In February, 183. The Germans were dispersing production to underground factories, using slave labor, cannibalizing rare materials from other programs. The industrial effort was enormous. But the jets were consuming fuel faster than Germany could produce it, and the pilots to fly them were increasingly scarce. By March of 1945, some Tu-62 units had aircraft that couldn't fly due to fuel shortages. They would tow jets to dispersal areas using horses or oxen, hide them under camouflage netting, and wait for fuel deliveries that sometimes never came. When fuel was available, pilots would fly multiple sorties per day to maximize the use of the precious resource, pushing themselves and their aircraft to the limits of endurance. The quality of German jet pilots varied wildly by this point. A few were exceptional. Men like Lieutenant Franz Schall, who scored 14 victories in the Tu-62, or Lieutenant Hans Guido Mutka, who may have been the first pilot to break the sound barrier during an emergency dive in a jet, though this claim remains disputed. These men understood the aircraft's strengths and limitations, and they were devastatingly effective. But most pilots were adequate at best, struggling with unreliable engines, fuel starvation, and constant Allied pressure. And the novices were simply fodder, killed in their first encounters with experienced Allied pilots who knew exactly how to exploit jet vulnerabilities. One such novice was Oberfähnrich Gunther Wegmann, who joined the 3rd Staffel of Jägerschwader 7 in March of 1945. Wegman had exactly 12 hours of jet flight time when he was declared combat-ready. On March 31, 1945, during his 3rd combat sortie, he encountered a formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts near Stendal. He attempted to engage them, but his inexperience betrayed him. He misjudged his speed, overshot his target, and pulled into a climb to regain altitude. The Thunderbolts followed him. At high speed, they couldn't keep up. But Wegman's climb was too steep. His airspeed bled off. The engines, already at high power, couldn't give him any more thrust. And as his speed dropped below 300 kilometers per hour, the Thunderbolts caught him. Lieutenant William Roach opened fire from 400 yards. His .50 caliber rounds hit the jet's port engine. It exploded, taking most of the left wing with it. Wegman's Tu-62 rolled inverted and plummeted to Earth. He died in the crash. He was 19 years old, and he'd been in combat for 11 days. Stories like Wegman's were repeated dozens of times in the final months of the war. Young pilots, hastily trained, sent into combat in aircraft they barely understood, killed by Allied pilots with years of experience. The Tu-62 was a magnificent machine, but it couldn't compensate for inadequate training and overwhelming numerical inferiority. By April of 1945, Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany. Airfields were being overrun. Fuel stocks were exhausted. And the Tu-62 units, scattered and desperate, were making their final sorties. On April 10, 1945, a flight of Spitfires from 132 Squadron encountered two Tu-62s near Lübeck. The jets were flying low, hugging the terrain, trying to avoid radar detection. But they were spotted visually, and the Spitfires dove to engage. The first jet saw them coming and poured on power, accelerating away. It escaped. The second jet, piloted by Lieutenant Hans Waldmann, tried to turn and fight. It was the same mistake Buttmann had made 6 months earlier over Nijmegen. Waldmann fired a burst that missed, then tried to run. But he'd lost too much speed in the turn. The Spitfires, led by Flight Lieutenant John Shepard, closed the distance and opened fire. Waldmann's jet was hit repeatedly. The starboard engine began to burn. He jettisoned his canopy and attempted to bail out, but at low altitude and high speed, the attempt failed. He struck the tailplane during his exit and was killed instantly. His body fell separately from the aircraft. Both impacted near Plön in Schleswig-Holstein. It was one of the last Tu-62 losses of the war. 8 days later, on April 18th, Adolf Hitler spent his final birthday in the Führerbunker in Berlin while Soviet artillery pounded the city above him. Tu-62 units still flew that day, still tried to intercept Allied bombers, still fought despite knowing the war was lost. Some jets were flown until they ran completely out of fuel, then abandoned on highways or in fields. Others were deliberately destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. On May 2nd, 1945, the last operational Tu-62 sortie was flown. Luftwaffe units in northern Germany surrendered to British forces. The pilots were ordered to fly their jets to designated Allied airfields and surrender them intact. Some complied. Others refused, destroying their aircraft rather than handing them over to the enemy. The final toll of the jet war was sobering. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Messerschmitt Tu-62s between July of 1944 and the war's end. Of these, roughly 700 entered operational service. The rest were destroyed in Allied bombing raids, lost to accidents, or never delivered due to transportation breakdowns. Of the 700 operational jets, approximately 100 were lost in air-to-air combat. Another 250 were destroyed on the ground by bombing or strafing. 100 more were lost to accidents, many caused by engine failures. The remaining 250 were captured intact or destroyed by their own crews. In return, German jets claimed approximately 745 Allied aircraft destroyed. The exact number is disputed, with German claims reaching as high as 1,000 and Allied records confirming lower figures. But even accepting the more conservative estimates, the kill ratio was roughly 7-1 in favor of the jets. This sounds impressive until you consider the strategic context. 745 Allied aircraft represented less than 1% of total Allied air strength in Europe by 1945. The losses were painful, but sustainable. The Allies replaced destroyed aircraft within weeks, sometimes days. Germany could not replace its jets, its fuel, or its trained pilots at anything approaching the rate of loss. More critically, the jets failed in their primary mission, stopping the Allied bombing offensive. German cities continued to burn. Factories continued to be destroyed. Oil production, already crippled, dropped to nearly zero by March of 1945. The synthetic fuel plants that the jets needed to operate were themselves prime targets of Allied bombing, creating a vicious cycle where jets consumed fuel to defend refineries that couldn't produce enough fuel to keep the jets flying. Squadron leader Roderick Smith, the Canadian pilot who'd scored the first jet victory on October 5, 1944, survived the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership and combat record. After the war, he returned to Canada, where he lived quietly until his death in 1992. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he did note in one interview that the Tu-62 was the most dangerous aircraft I ever faced, but also the most fragile. It was a glimpse of the future, but one that came too late to change anything. Flight Lieutenant Tony Gaze, the Tempest pilot who'd shot down a Tu-62 in December of 1944, had a different perspective. After the war, he became a racing driver, competing in Formula One and other motorsports. When asked about his jet victory, he said simply, "It was vulnerable when it was slow, like any other aircraft. The trick was being there when it was slow." The legacy of the Messerschmitt Tu-62 extended far beyond the Second World War. After Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams scoured the country for intact jets and technical documentation. The Soviets captured several Tu-62s and used them to develop their own jet programs. The Americans and British did the same. German engineers who'd worked on the project were recruited by both sides in the emerging Cold War. The Tu-62's design influenced the American F-86 Sabre, the Soviet MiG-15, and virtually every jet fighter developed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The swept-wing planform, the axial-flow turbojet engines, even the armament configuration were studied and copied. The lessons learned from the Tu-62's successes and failures shaped jet fighter development for decades. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. The Tu-62 proved that technological superiority alone couldn't win wars. Germany had fielded the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, crewed by some of the most experienced pilots, supported by sophisticated ground control systems. And it hadn't mattered. Superior numbers, better logistics, adequate training, and tactical flexibility defeated technological brilliance. The Allied pilots who fought the Tu-62s learned this lesson well. They learned that wonder weapons could be countered by intelligent tactics and determination. They learned that innovation happened on both sides, and that adaptation was as important as invention. And they learned that even the most advanced aircraft had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by pilots brave enough and smart enough to find them. On the Dutch farmland northeast of Nijmegen, where Hauptmann Hans Christoph Buttmann's jet crashed on October 5, 1944, a small memorial now stands. It marks the spot where the future collided with the present, where propellers defeated jets, where 5 Spitfire pilots proved that the impossible was merely difficult. Locals tend the memorial, placing flowers on the anniversary of the crash, remembering both the Allied pilots who fought and the young German pilot who died. The war had 7 months left to run after that October afternoon. 7 months of brutal fighting, massive casualties, and continued jet operations. But the myth of invincibility had been shattered over Nijmegen. The wonder weapon could bleed. And knowing that, Allied pilots pressed their attacks with renewed confidence, hunting jets at their bases, exploiting their vulnerabilities and slowly, systematically, destroying Germany's last technological hope. The jet age had arrived in 1944, but it would be another generation before jets truly dominated the skies. The Messerschmitt 262 was too advanced for its time, too fragile for its circumstances, and too few in number to change the war's outcome. It was a revolutionary aircraft that fought in a conventional war, and the conventional war won. Squadron Leader Smith's combat report from October 5, 1944 remains in the archives of the Royal Canadian Air Force. The language is spare, factual, almost mundane. But those few paragraphs document a turning point, the moment when the future became vulnerable to the present, when 5 Spitfire pilots wrote a new chapter in aerial warfare. Their victory wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and it mattered. The Messerschmitt 262 was the most advanced fighter of World War II. But advancement without fuel, without trained pilots, without numerical superiority, and without time was just potential. And potential alone doesn't win wars. The Spitfires over Nijmegen proved that. 5 propeller-driven fighters from the previous generation of technology defeating the next generation through skill, teamwork, and the exploitation of fundamental vulnerabilities that even revolutionary design couldn't eliminate. That's the real lesson of October 5, 1944. Not that jets were vulnerable, but that every weapon system has weaknesses. Not that technology doesn't matter, but that it's never sufficient by itself. And not that the past can defeat the future, but that the present, when wielded with intelligence and courage, can hold its own against even the most intimidating innovations. The story of the Messerschmitt 262 and the pilots who fought it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, innovation and courage shaped history in unexpected ways. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating technological battles, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share this video with anyone who appreciates real history told with the detail and accuracy it deserves.